Thank you so much, Becky, for that beautiful, beautiful music that you played for us. We really appreciate it. This is Rebecca Sneller, our pianist. I just wanted to say good evening, and my name is Wendy Sturm, and I'm the president of the Women's City Club. And I'd like to welcome all of you to our program this evening, our first 100 years. A special thank you to the Grand Rapids Public Museum for inviting Women's City Club to be a part of the Grand Rapids Stories program and to collaborate with us and in hosting this wonderful event. The event is being recorded and will be on the website, excuse me, and available to view in the coming years. And now it is my honor to introduce Judge Sarah Smolinski, who will provide opening remarks.
Thank you, Wendy. I sure appreciate that. Hope I'm not too loud. I'm used to being in the courtroom. You're all looking pretty good. I hope probation is going well for you. Oh, sorry, that was last night's speech. Well, I am so pleased to be here and honored to be part of our first 100 years for the Women's City Club of Grand Rapids. I think we should make it the best night ever because I'm not sure I'll be here for the second 100 years, although you never know, life can be quite funny sometimes. I love that the Women's City Club always talks about the city is our clubhouse. After leaving the Sweet House, and we'll hear more about all of that through the history of the Women's City Club, the city is the clubhouse for the Women's City Club. And I think that's really something to feel proud of and adds to the excitement of what the Women's City Club is all about. When you think about the enrichment programs that you have been involved in over the years and how much community impact you've had, from donating clothes to the Women's Resource Center to being involved in some of the high school programs to help kids, this Women's City Club knows no boundaries. They're there in our community helping, reaching out, and making an impact. Besides all the good, you have a lot of fun. You have a lot of fun. When you think about some of the programs that you're involved in with Let's Go to Lunch, Let's Do Dinner, the book club, class in session, day away, coffee Tuesday, together time, community outreach, all the different things that are done, it's just a wonder why I'm not a member yet. My mother was a member. Linda's mother was a member. Linda's grandmother was a member. We have Women's City Club in our blood. And when Diane Jones so graciously gave me the book, signed by both of you, thank you very much, I flipped through it while we had some time, and I'm pretty positive I saw my mother in a photograph on page 27. I immediately took a photo of it and sent it to one of my siblings to get verification what they think. You know, part of it was my excitement because I did want to see my mom or Linda's mom or one of our family members in there. And I do, and I'm pretty sure I'm right. You'd say, well, what is her problem? She can't recognize her mother. But, you know, it was about 55 years ago, the photo. It's in a group of, 20 or 30 women. She's in the back. I need to get home, and yes, I do have a magnifying glass. I have a magnifying glass at my home that I'm going to use when I get home to see my mom. Now, I wanted to tell you, as it relates to tonight, there is a lot of excitement about listening to Carol and Marcie, who I'll introduce in a minute. But there's a lot of excitement about all the effort and energy so many people put into this, none more than Carol and Marcie. But they've divided tonight's program into 4 sections. And I think you saw it on the board, and it's in your brochure as well. If it's broken down into eras, if I can say that, years, whatever you want to describe it as. and Carol and Marcie are going to go back and forth. They'd like you, it's going to be hard, but listen, they'd like you to hold your applause because they want to get through each of the 4 segments before we give them a rousing standing ovation. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our 2 speakers, 2 of the best authors that you're ever going to read, right here from Grand Rapids, right here, both members of the Women's City Club. First, I'm going to start with Carol Dodge. Carol has lived a beautiful life. I just met her daughter, one of the kids. Can I call you a kid still? Okay, kid. And Carol raised a family. She worked in the insurance industry for 35 plus years, and she was one of the founding members of the Sweet House Foundation. I know Carol Dodge as the historian at the Women's City Club, and she has been the past president of the Women's City Club back in the years 2005 through 7. She's been a member of the Women's City Club for over 35 years. I was going to say the whole 100 years, but I didn't know if you'd go with it. And we are so, so pleased to have Carol Dodge as part of this huge project celebrating our first 100 years for the Women's City Club. Then we will hear from Marcie Woods, the co-author of our first 100 years. And Marcie is a professional educator. I mean, you pick the school, she's been there to teach. I mean, you could talk about Northview, Forest Hills, Grand Rapids CC that used to be junior college where I was and played ball there. Professional educator to the max. The Kent Intermediate School District, focusing on many of the gifted programs that they have for kids, and very proudly kept the bulletin going for the Women's City Club on a monthly basis as the editor-in-chief of the bulletin for the Women's City Club. So without further ado, and we only have the museum till midnight, and they have a lot that they're going to share with us, but ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pride to introduce to you, and Carol's going to go first, but I'm introducing Carol Dodge and Marcie Woods. Good job, you guys.
$100. Can you believe it? 100 years. It was a group of women 100 years ago had a dream that they hoped they would have just an outstanding social club. And for a century, women worked passionately so that we could gather today to celebrate the City Club's 100th anniversary. What a wonderful thing this is. The story of the beginning of our organization has been told and retold, and it's my pleasure tonight to share it with you, and I'm just very, very proud of it, and I'm also deeply in debt to our founding mothers, fathers, sisters, and all the women who followed our founding members and spent countless hours to make the Women's City Club such a very special organization. The year is 1923. It's the Roaring 20s. It's a jazz age, another year of prohibition and speakeasies. It's the women have the right to vote now. In May of this year, the Attorney General declared that it was legal for women to wear trousers anywhere. Women have the right to vote now. and it's a year of prosperity, and there are new roles for women. And this is our story. It's a hot July evening in Grand Rapids. A group of Altrusa women club members sat on the steps of the new YWCA after a meeting, and their conversation turned to discuss about the social clubs that their husbands and their fathers belonged to. And they longed to have a place where they could gather and socialize and entertain and be informed. And it was that evening that the spark was ignited and they went into action. They worked diligently through the fall, and on January 4, 1924, an enthusiastic group of women came together to finalize our organization. Their first task was to write the purpose, that they would be women of common interest in the welfare of the city, in public issues, and in a clubhouse. Well, the next issue was the dues, and someone suggested that the dues be $10 a year, and that was hotly debated. One future member declared, no, I don't think any women, well, unless they're business women, would have $10 to spend for something like that. And another one said, well, I can bake a cake for a sale because that comes out of our grocery money, but it'll never happen that just outright I would have $10. And then another one said, 200, we'll be lucky if we have 200 women. And how could you run an organization with $2,000? And in that, the president exploded, the first president, Mrs. May Bowen, and she said, 200, I see nothing less than 1,000 members. And her enthusiasm and excitement certainly changed the atmosphere of the meeting, and the club was off to a good start with dues of $10. Then they had to consider where they would meet. The newly remodeled Morton Hotel offered free use for 3 months of 2 beautiful rooms on the mezzanine, one for the club office and one for the lounge. And the membership meetings would be held in the hotel dining rooms. The first official meeting was January 24, 1924, our anniversary, and Mrs. Dudley Waters was the first to pay her dues and received the membership card number 1. And with that, the club was off and running. We still enjoy many things, many activities today that began 100 years ago at the Morton House. Weekly programs were set for Thursdays, followed by a luncheon. The programs were set for Thursday because that was a maid's day out in Grand Rapids, and our members had no one at home to prepare their lunch. On other days, classes were held: French, bridge, parliamentary law, literature, painting, current events, calligraphy, a variety of interesting and helpful classes, and afterwards, tea and fine dining. Well, the club outgrew the Morton House very quickly. When they had their first real membership meeting, 650 women attended, and the manager of the hotel said to our president, that greatly taxed the facility. And so in January, a year later, 1925, the club had reached their goal of 1,000 members, and they moved to the Silas Godfrey House, which was next to Park Congregational Church. They met there for 2.5 years. The club was started at just the right time with the right people. The community leaders among the women of Grand Rapids were the early leaders in the City Club, and they were diligent in inviting other civic-minded women to join. The goal was to have their own clubhouse where all the varied women's groups could also meet, like the League of Women Voters in Zonta and Altrusa. They all wanted a place to hold meetings and to relax, where they could be social and among like-minded people. When the Sweet House came on the market at 254 Fulton East in 1927, the club purchased the rundown building, and it arranged for an addition and remodeling. It took 8 months to rebuild and to find furnishings, and almost everything inside of the house was given or loaned to us. The fine furniture, the antiques, the china. The club moved into the location with a gala grand opening. And at the end of the event, Dudley Waters said to his wife, "Let's go home, Florence, and see what we have left." By the end of the decade, the club had 1,800 members and 165 on a waiting list. The economy was glum with the market crash in 1929, but optimism was high at the Women's City Club. It had become a welcoming second home for many, many women in the community. The 1930s rolled on in, and our club was not immune to the troubled economy, the Great Depression. Teacher members were allowed to pay their restaurant and dues with Board of Education script. Membership dropped down to 800 in 1933. We lost over half of our members, and the board worked diligently to keep our doors open. Our remaining members were very empathetic for those less fortunate during the Depression. Our auditorium was turned into a sewing room and a work room, and clothing was made for families in need, and food, books, and toys were collected and distributed. And as the economy turned around, so did the membership numbers. In 1936, membership had become so desirable and had increased so much that a limit was set on membership, 1,400, and they also had a waiting list. They also started a new installment plan so that members could pay their $10 dues quarterly, $2.50 a quarter. After the Depression, the restaurant was very popular. Lunch was available for 35 to 65 cents, and dinners were 65 to 85 cents. The 1930s were a more formal time. Teas, tea dances, dinner dances were very popular, and many groups met at the clubhouse. Their fees for building and room rentals helped substantially, as did the restaurant usage. Many well-known people, guests, were presenters at the City Club in the 1930s. Among them were Randolph Churchill, Winston's son, Gene Tunney, the heavyweight boxing champion, aviatrix Amelia Earhart, movie comedian Zazu Pitts, and John Forsyth, the horticulturalist who introduced the forsythia bush, just to name a few. And the first Bob Cratchit holiday dinner was served, which became a tradition for 77 years. Remarkably, during these difficult depression years, the club did not miss a single mortgage payment, and we ended the 1930s on a high note. The mortgage of the club was burned, and after 12 years, we were debt-free. The decades of the 40s were called the war years. Hazel Whitaker Vandenberg was a charter member of our club, and Senator Vandenberg's wife kept club members abreast with her chatty monthly bulletin reports from Washington, D.C. Urgent pleas went out to our members monthly for volunteers to help in the National Defense Program. And again, our auditorium was turned into a workroom where surgical dressings were wrapped, the sewing machines were humming again, making surgical gowns and baby blankets, baby layettes. Classes were held to train gray ladies who would serve in city hospitals to relieve the shortage of the medical staff. And our members were active. Many were heads of war relief programs in the city. But throughout these trying times, the City Club lectures became so popular that the auditorium could not hold all of the members, so loudspeakers had to be installed throughout the house, and members were even known to sit on the stairways so that they could hear the programs. The club was especially pleased to have English comedian Gracie Fields as a guest of honor in 1941. She was on a benefit concert for the British War Relief. The club had its own projects for the war effort. Money was collected to buy personal items for wounded soldiers, and monthly hospitality evenings were held in the club to entertain the soldiers from the Army Weather School that was held in the Pantlan. At the end of the war, the club celebrated and offered Thanksgiving for victory, and now it was time to look ahead and plan for the future.
I love that song. The 1950s ushered in events that showcased the Women's City Club's prominence in the affairs of Grand Rapids. Probably the highlight of the entire decade was when we hosted royalty. Queen Juliana of the Netherlands and her husband, Prince Bernhard, were actually visiting Calvin College, but the mayor and Mrs. Goebel presided over a luncheon for them at the City Club, honoring the royal couple. Now, in January 1950, the death, in 1950 of founding member and longtime correspondent Hazel Whittaker Vandenberg was a tragic event. She had written for us, for our little bulletin, 10 articles a year for 14 years. And people think, well, that was just a cute little article. She was a professional journalist. Before she married the senator, she was employed by the Chicago Tribune. She knew her way around a typewriter. And those articles were magnificent. She was greatly missed, and in fact, the City Club named their auditorium for her. But other things happened in the 1950s. In January, the John Ball Zoological Society published their plans for the expansion of what at that time was a very small animal park. They published them in the WCC Bulletin. The society had promised to raise private funds towards the improvements, and the fact that their plans were published in a Woman's Society magazine speaks to who was their target audience. You see, when you have a bulletin going out to over 2,000 women, all of whom are charitably inclined, that explains why they planted their plans in our magazine. We might donate. Now, I mentioned the bulletin, and I love the bulletin. The bulletin was an extremely important part of WCC right from the beginning in 1924 with Miss Christine Keck. She was vice president and English teacher at Union High School. She was a founder, she was our third president, and she was also the co-author of the Elson Keck Readers, which were used in the Grand Rapids Public Schools for decades and actually were sold throughout the Midwest as being the finest way to teach youngsters grammar and literature. She was the first editor, and she saw, although her publication was very tiny, as you can see at the beginning, she saw if they made it bigger and included ads, perhaps it would defray the cost. She edited the newspaper for years, impeccably. And next came Miss Mabel Allen, who edited the bulletin for 35 years. I'm not going to do that. She did all of the ads and the editing, but she had a committee of 24 women gathering information and writing all the articles. And they needed a lot because, as you can probably tell, the thickness of the orange and the green ones, they were 50 pages long. In the January 1950 edition alone, there were 40 ads. And you think, ads? I mean, who would put an ad in a women's club newspaper? Let me tell you, we were popular. This first ad here shows a much older, probably from the 30s. And it is actually for the American Laundry and Dry Cleaning. But look at the pose. Wouldn't you like to be one of those women, dressed that well, that regal, and sending your laundry out? The other one comes from the 60s, and it would absolutely not fly today. The small print says, change girl talk into financial talk. It is still a man's world in banking, but at least as far back as the 60s, Doris was a vice president. But this was my favorite of the ads in the bulletin. The gas company ran a full-page ad on the back cover of the bulletin for decades, and each month featured a different member of the club standing in her kitchen at her gas range. They started in the 30s, and I would die to have that gas range. But the small print talks about the women's credentials. In the one for the 50s, and again, you can't read those, but it talks about how the lady involved is a member of not Junior League, a member of the League of Women Voters and of the Fountain Street Guild and the City Club and the Grand Rapids Council of the PTA, and it gives her address. But you get the message. Women who do, women who influence, cook with gas. Now, the bulletin covered all of the club activities, and it added humor and trips, and it also kept them in touch with the world. It presented local and national issues and urged members to vote. It promoted the public affairs committees, twice a month guest lecturers, and it showed us where we could be active. The goal was for each woman to be noteworthy in the life of the city. And we ended the decade with an all-time high of 2,400 members and another 400 on the waiting list. Now, it's now the 1960s, and membership was at a high still of 2,400, 300 of whom were on committees. They gave over 40,000 hours of volunteer work each year. But when you stop to think about it, that's 13% of the membership. What did we really have going for us? Hats. The Grand Rapids Press loved the Women's City Club, and they carefully and scrupulously reported on every major speaker we had and every large event, but they really went crazy over fashion. And so they put us all there in our hats, and it was absolutely true. I mean, they're wearing hats to Bridge Club. They wore hats all the time. But this was the last hurrah of the hats. They were actually much more serious than that. In the 60s, they started a 6-week series on local, national, and international affairs issues with 3 men who were at that time brand new to Grand Rapids. Dr. James Zumberger of the brand new Grand Valley State College, Dr. Weldon Frankfurter, Assistant Director of the Public Museum, and Paul Dreher of the Civic Theater, brand new in town. all with strong opinions on what the world is and should be. I could not find pictures of them as young men. Unfortunately, these pictures all came from obituaries. But we didn't just listen to men talk. We had something starting in the 60s called armchair cruises. They began on Tuesday nights after a club dinner with food related to whatever country was going to be shown on the slides. And these were exceptionally well attended. And so popular, the club continued to hold them for 20 years. World travelers, including our past president, Julia Belknap Baldwin, and her husband, Dr. Melvin Baldwin, were frequent presenters, as were several other couples and adventurous single women. Mary Toulos and David here tonight were also presenters in the last stages of the armchair cruises. But really, the big one was when Ann Landers came. The house was filled to overflowing. I mentioned this to a young friend of mine, and she said, "Who is Ann Landers?" When I explained what her job was, she said, "Oh, dear Abby." I said, "No, that's her sister." That really confused things. In 1966, the City Club got a new seal. This was designed by their member, Marie Kirkpatrick, who happened to be a National Industrial Design Authority on the board and an instructor at Kendall College. And in the same time, WCC needed parking because it's the 60s and women are driving. They bought 2 houses on the opposite side of Lafayette, knocked them down, and paved Paradise and put in a parking lot. Now, at the end of the decade, they still had 2,400 members, but the waiting list had dropped to only 36. Now, a lot of those members had been absorbed into the membership. But 1960s were a tipping point, not just for Women's City Club, but for the nation. That was the last time we had high numbers of members in civic organizations. From then, and the same thing was happening all across the nation, country clubs, social clubs, churches, civic organizations, all began to show declining numbers. The 1970s introduced a time of firsts. I was wondering which one you were saying. She was on the board. This was a picture of the board of directors. And it's not just because it's May that there are no hats. It's because of the freedom. Notice the casual clothing. Some of them are even wearing sandals and not a single hat. This was a time of real firsts. For the first thing, the club turned 50, and women could register under their own names. They did not have to be Mrs. Him. After years of fighting and debate, they got a liquor license. And one of the most significant things is that Helen Claytor joined the WCC. Helen Claytor was the first first African-American woman in the United States to be a president of a community-wide WCA. She went on to become the national president of YWCA, and she chose to extend her membership in civic organizations to Women's City Club, and she was a member until she was in her 90s in 2000. It was also the 70s, National Bicentennial, Grand Rapids Sesquicentennial, and the bulletin was cut back to 16 pages. But there were other facts, too, for the 1970s. Membership dropped a little It was starting to then. And they discovered that if you have fewer members, you have less income. They dropped the bulletin in pages because at the end of the year, at the end of the decade, they were in deficits in their bulletin budget. They were in far more deficit into the dining room budget, and even the parking lot and library had overspent. After years of plenty, the club had to dip into their reserve funds. The 1980s began with 1,700 members. That's very respectable. But the clubhouse was 120 years old. Can you say high maintenance? Fashionettes, however, continued. They added Lee's and Jacobson's. The travel committee booked trips to Toronto, Canada, and to Harbor Springs, Michigan. And an absolute favorite for Grand Rapids was Barbara Ranella, who came here for the first time and in 1985. And she made a repeat visit for 15 years because of the absolute well, she was a fantastic performer. She did book reviews in costume. English teacher reference. However, this was the time of rising inflation, higher costs, and an aging house. So the women did what they could, what women always do. They bottled and sold the salad dressing of the house. They saved grocery receipts. They increased the cost of the parking tokens. They had a benefit play at Circle Theater, but they still ended the decade with a deficit, and membership continued to drop. 1988, 1,200, down by 500, and that's down, no doobie-doobie, just down.
The 1990s was a decade of downs and ups. In the world, we lost two important women, Mother Teresa and Princess Diana, and there was a 24-hour coverage of Desert Storm. But for the City Club, a big up was the installation of the lift in the fall of 1995, 3 years after a very diligent campaign called Rising to the Future. More than $115,000 was raised, which included a very generous gift from Betty Ford in memory of her mother, who was a former member. Another big up was the completion of a major project of the History Committee, compiling into a book of all of Hazel Vandenberg's monthly newsletters to the City Club about her activities in Washington from 1928 to 1950. A gala event was held to formally present the book to Mayor Logie and some other city officials, and the mayor expressed gratitude to the City Club for sharing these treasured reports with the community. Other ups were our wonderful programs and events. Tom and Sherry Hagan had their first of many appearances with us. The popular book reviewer, Barbara Ranella, continued to draw standing room crowds. There were armchair cruises from Russia to Ireland and around the world. We had actual trips to Meadowbrook, Chicago, Stratford, Mackinac Island, wonderful fashionettes by Steckety's, Jacobson's, Redwood Ross, and SG Jade. The board continue to work vigorously to promote membership and retention. The bylaws were amended to change the word woman to person. Joint ventures with the World Affairs Council and the Ladies Literary Guild were initiated to allow members who work to enjoy club. We opened on the second and fourth Saturdays. And while all these efforts helped, budget issues still became a major concern as house maintenance costs continued to mount. The dining room consistently lost money, and over 10 years, there were 4 different catering companies. In 1998, a special fundraising campaign was held, and more than $40,000 was raised, which enabled the club to get through that decade. And it was apparent that there had to be changes, and a long-term planning committee was formed. Well, the world slipped quietly into the new century without the Y2K prediction coming true. We watched the horror of the 9/11 attacks, and we're worried over the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But technology made phenomenal advances. And in Grand Rapids, we welcomed the Grand DeVos Convention Center, and the city was richly blessed with the additions to the Medical Mile. The Women's City Club stepped into the new century with anxiety, with anticipation, a committed membership, and for some, a vision for the future. It was a decade of transition for the club. We did continue the tradition of excellent programs and activities. Favorite presenters included Dale Schramer with his musicians from Grand Valley, John Varino and Bill Vitz from the Symphony, our very favorite, Judge Sarah, popular Deanna House with her delightful cooking classes. And we had special guest performers. We had Abe and Mary Lincoln, and Abigail Adams, Molly Pitcher, and even Desdemona Sweet. We learned from city and world leaders. Club members traveled to see the Rockwell exhibit in Chicago and the Van Gogh in Detroit, and members were treated to several summers when we had a shore thing. We took a trip to one of the nice recreational spots on our Great Lakes. We continued classes. We even had a class for bridge that was taught for men, that was taught by our beloved Pearl Clark. Fashion ads were still very, very popular. And also very popular at the City Club for 10 years was our Woman City Antique Roadshow with Ward Paul and Chuck Schunkeneck, which, in addition to our members, brought in many people from the community. And every year, through the YWCA, we took a family and we donated clothing, school clothes for the children and gifts for the children, and also we donated clothing for women needing interview attire. It was an exciting time in 2005 when we named our dining room after the first lady of our house. It became Desdemona's Dining Room. And a few months later, we named our popular Amber Crunch dessert in her honor, and it became our signature dessert, Desdemona's Delight. At the end of the decade, we had 223 members, and 15 were distinguished 50-year members. But our dwindling assets, because of the deficit budgets, all became a very critical issue. And as we entered this new century, something had to be done. We talked about it a long time, but now we had to make changes. We had to take action. We changed from having a catering company to hiring our own chef in 2002. And once again, our food was par excellence, and our chef even received the Best Chef in Grand Rapids Award 3 times by the Grand Rapids Magazine Readers' Poll. We automated our bookkeeping system so that it could be done in-house. saving several thousands of dollars, and importantly, giving the board timely reports. We had a strong marketing committee who worked diligently to promote the club, and more evening programs were held with rave reviews by the members. And a highly significant event was the formation of the 501c3 foundation, the Sweet House Foundation, which was set up by the Women's City Club so that members and the community could donate tax-free dollars for the maintenance and preservation of the house. And by doing this, we ended the last 3 years of the decade in the black. Plus, we were able to do some much-needed maintenance and repair on the clubhouse. And the fifth thing, the foundation's invitation to be an art prize venue, which we did for 10 years, brought thousands of people to the clubhouse and gave the City Club good publicity and over 100 new members. So we left the decade with a board and a committees working diligently for our financial security to ensure that the people in our community would be able to enjoy the many benefits of the Women's City Club in years to come.
Thus, the new decade began with relief, hope, and high tech. WCC entered the electronic age with a website and social media presence. And for us old ladies, that's saying something. At the same time, the History Committee preserved the past by acquiring all of the records of the 75 years that we had been as a club, and carried them off to the Grand Rapids Public Library, where they are archived. Great programming continued with, only instead of her coming to us, we went to her. She gave us a tour of the 63rd District Court and even invited us into her chambers. Now, as Carol mentioned, over the years, Art Prize, tens of thousands, literally, came through the house. Fred Bivens reconfigured the auditorium into a multi-walled art gallery, and members of the club and others in the community volunteered hundreds of hours there, and it attracted more women to try a trial membership. Things were looking up, and then the computer system crashed, and the club manager retired, and the new software that the new system had for club management was too complicated for the staff to use. The dining room manager quit. Eventually, the treasurer quit. But to all appearances, the club was doing beautifully. The average member was still having a great time. We had a great fundraiser in 2017 for Christmas decorations, and that saw a spectacular event called the Illumination Celebration. But that was Christmas, and in the new year, the general manager quit. And then came the bad news. Between the dining room consistently losing money, staffing turnover, and various other catastrophes of a financial nature, our reserved funds were just about up. In fact, they were on the endangered list. The new accountants gave the club 6 months until bankruptcy. We had choices. Do nothing and let the club die. Stay in the house, but close the dining room, or move to a different location. We chose to leave. We left our home of 91 years on April 28th, 2018. But guess what? We are alive and well. We found out under the dynamic leadership of these three women that on the other side of that front door, a whole world awaited us. Women's City Club overcame decades of challenges, and this is our new reality. We have new locations. We met at Kent Country Club for 2.5 years. Now we are meeting in 2 different churches that are so pleased to rent a weekday to us, people who know how to pick up after themselves, and we can eat anywhere we want. We have new opportunities for giving. We have created the Impact Award in 2019 for juniors at Union High School. We donate socks to In the Image. We have donated thousands of dollars worth of new clothes and gifts to the women of the Veterans Home, the Women's Resource Center, the Youth Collective, and now we are focusing on unsheltered folks. We have new events. We've started a new book club. We have social time. We have things we can take partners, spouses, and other guests to. Oktoberfest, Day Away. It's like a burden is lifted. The Women's City Club created a legacy that is embodied in the Sweet House. We gifted it, complete with art, antiques, and property, to the community when we established the Sweet House Foundation. But that's merely our physical legacy. Our living legacy is our members. Many of our members, individually, throughout our history, have been active in nearly every influential organization in the city, including museums, arts, opera, ballet, theater, school districts, charities, choruses, orchestras, denominations, service clubs, library boards, hospital guilds, garden clubs, food banks, and thrift shops. It's hard to find a member who has not served on a board of another organization besides WCC. We are and have been always women of influence, of impact, separately and together, and have been for 100 years. Together, we find the support, inspiration, enrichment, and friendship that tie us all together. Our social and educational programs, classes, the opportunities to build relationships continue to offer the women of Grand Rapids a place to belong and to give back to the community. That is the history of the Women's City Club.